I was 67 years old when my daughter handed me my own suitcase and told me the house wasn't mine anymore. She said it the way you'd explain a bill that had come due. Matter of fact, like the conversation had already happened and I was just catching up. Daddy, you signed everything over months ago, you just don't remember. She held up a document with my signature at the bottom, and I stared at it for a long time, trying to figure out how my name could look so exactly like my name and still be a lie. My wife Clara had died 14 months earlier. Breast cancer diagnosed late, gone fast. She'd worked at the school cafeteria for 22 years and saved money the way only people who grew up poor know how to save. When she died, she left me the house we'd bought together in 1991, a small retirement account I'd been building since my 30s, and 34 years of a life that had felt, for most of it, like enough. My daughter Cassie and her husband Beau had moved in 2 years before Clara passed. To help, she said. And in the beginning, they did help. Drove Clara to appointments, cooked sometimes, kept the yard. I was grateful, I told them so. I was working the problem of watching my wife die, and I didn't have much left over for suspicion. I should have. Standing in my own living room that November morning with my suitcase at my feet, I tried to argue. The house was mine. Clara's will was clear. Beau stepped in then, soft-voiced, reasonable, and explained that there were tax implications, medical debts, complications I hadn't understood when I signed. He used words like fiduciary and estate management and your own good. And when I asked to call my lawyer, Cassie said, Daddy, you don't have a lawyer. We handle all that now. I looked at Beau. Then I looked at my daughter, at the woman I'd taught to ride a bike in that same driveway, whose college tuition I'd taken a second shift at the shop to pay. She met my eyes for exactly 1 second and then looked at the window. I need you out today, she said. We have someone coming to look at the place this afternoon. I took my suitcase. I took $20 from the emergency cash I kept in the kitchen drawer. The last 20, everything else had apparently been handled. I walked out the front door. Behind me, I heard the deadbolt click into place. It wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. Just a small, clean sound, the way a door closes on something that's finished. I stood on the porch for a moment in the cold November air and thought about 30 years of mortgage payments, about the gutters I'd cleaned, and the furnace I'd replaced, and the night I'd stayed up until 2 in the morning fixing the kitchen sink so Clara wouldn't have to go without hot water. All of it on the other side of that door now. All of it locked away. I started walking. November in East Tennessee doesn't come in gently. The cold comes off the mountains like something with a purpose, finds every gap in your jacket, works down into your collar and up through your boots. I'd lived in this part of the country my whole life, and I'd never once been afraid of the cold. That afternoon, for the first time, I understood what it felt like to have it as an enemy. I walked for hours without a plan, which is not how I operate. I spent 30 years as a diesel mechanic. I don't move without knowing what I'm moving toward. But that day I just walked, because walking meant I wasn't standing still thinking about where I was going to sleep. Around dusk, I found a BP station still open on Route 63 and I went inside. A young woman behind the counter didn't ask any questions when I stood by the coffee machine longer than made sense. She refilled my cup without saying a word. I drank it in the corner by the window and watched the sky go dark over the ridge and tried to think. $20. I counted it again in my head, a 10 and 2 5s. Enough for maybe 2 nights in the cheapest motel I knew of, which was 40 miles south and not cheap enough. Enough for a week's worth of rice and beans if I had somewhere to cook them. Not enough for a security deposit anywhere. I slept that night in my truck. I'd taken it, at least. It was in my name and I'd had the keys in my pocket. I parked behind a Dollar General in Coalfield and kept the engine running for heat until I started worrying about the gas, then turned it off and pulled my jacket around myself and tried to sleep. The cold found me anyway. It always does. In the morning, I drove to the courthouse to use the bathroom, and on my way back out, I stopped at the bulletin board they keep in the lobby, next to the tax assessor's office. I don't know why I stopped. I wasn't looking for anything specific. Maybe I just needed something to read, something that was real and concrete and had nothing to do with my daughter's face. The county tax sale notice was pinned near the bottom, printed on yellow paper. I read it twice, then I read it a third time because one item on the list didn't seem possible. Parcel 0744112R, derelict farmstead, Cider Hill Road, 2 acres condemned structure, outstanding taxes, minimum bid, $20,000 sale, Friday 10 a.m. room 104. $20, the exact amount I had. I stood there in the courthouse lobby holding that yellow paper and I felt something I couldn't name right away. It wasn't hope. Hope is too light a word for what a 67-year-old man feels when he spent the night in his truck. It was more like recognition. Like something in the universe had just blinked at me. I folded the paper and put it in my breast pocket next to the photo of Clara I always carry. Room 104 smelled like old carpet and radiator heat. About a dozen people had shown up. A couple of farmers, a man in a suit who worked for some development company, a few folks I didn't recognize. They clustered near the front with their folders and their phones, the easy posture of people who do this regularly. The county clerk read through the list like he was reading a grocery receipt. Farm equipment, mineral rights on a piece of scrubland nobody wanted, a truck with a blown engine. He went through 6 items before he got to mine. Parcel 07441R, he said. Cider Hill Road, condemned structure 2 acres. Minimum bid, $20. He looked up, do I have $20? Silence. I heard one of the farmers say something under his breath to the man beside him, and both of them smiled. I raised my hand. The room didn't go quiet so much as it shifted, the kind of collective adjustment that happens when everyone notices something at once. A few people turned to look at me. The man from the development company glanced over and then away, not bothering to hide his amusement. $20, I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. The clerk looked at me over his reading glasses. Any other bids? Nobody moved. Sold, he said, and brought the gavel down. The property was 4 miles out of town, on a road that stopped being paved about halfway there. I drove it in my truck, and when I finally saw the place, I sat in the cab for a long time before getting out. It had been a working farm once, probably in the 1940s. You could still see what it had been. A proper farmhouse, not large but solidly built, set back from the road on a small rise. The structure had given way badly. The front porch had collapsed entirely. The roof had failed on the left side. The windows were long gone. The siding had curled away from the exterior like old skin. One corner of the house had actually begun to list, pulling slowly toward the earth like it was tired of fighting. But the chimney was still standing. 80-year-old fieldstone, stacked by someone who'd known exactly what they were doing, and it hadn't moved an inch. And there was a hand-dug well in the side yard, covered with a weathered wooden board. I lifted it carefully. The water was clear and cold, 30 feet down. I dropped a stone and heard the splash. In the cellar, accessible through a storm door that still latched, I found a wooden shelf along the back wall. 6 mason jars of what might have been tomatoes, lids still sealed after years of waiting. 3 cans of pork and beans, a jar of instant coffee. Whoever had last lived here hadn't left in a hurry. They'd left carefully, like someone who intended to come back. I sat down on the cellar steps and held one of those cans and thought, this is where I live now. The first nights were brutal. November became December, and the cold that pushed through the collapsed section of roof was not the kind you argue with. It was the kind you survive 1 hour at a time. I slept in my sleeping bag on a piece of plywood I'd pulled from the barn, laid over the driest section of floor I could find. I worked during the days. I had no tools worth speaking of, just what was in the truck, a pry bar, a hammer, a box of miscellaneous screws. I pulled rotted boards from the interior walls with my hands, stacking them in the barn. I swept debris with a piece of pine branch. I moved slowly and methodically, the way I used to approach a seized engine, figure out what's actually broken before you assume everything is. What I found was that most of the damage was surface decay. The exterior stone foundation was solid. The interior framing, the load-bearing walls, the support posts, had been built from old-growth timber, tight-grained and dense even after decades of abandonment. When I knocked on it, it knocked back. I worked until my hands bled. Then I wrapped them in strips torn from an old flannel shirt and kept working. The alternative, stopping, thinking about Cassie's face, thinking about that deadbolt, was not something I could afford. Otto showed up on a Tuesday. He drove a rust-colored Dodge pickup to the end of the lane and got out and stood there like he'd been invited, which he hadn't been. He was 71 years old, built like a man who'd spent 6 decades doing physical work, with the kind of hands that tell you everything about a person before they open their mouth. He introduced himself, ran a feed and hardware supply over in Wartburg, had heard from the clerk at the courthouse that someone bought the Cider Hill place. Thought I'd come see if you needed anything, he said. I told him I couldn't pay him. Didn't ask you to, he said. He'd brought 2 boxes in the truck bed, a roll of 6mm poly sheeting, a box of roofing screws, 2 sheets of OSB, a handsaw, a level. He looked at the house the way a doctor looks at a patient, thorough, not alarmed. Roof first, he said. Before anything else. You seal the roof, everything else is workable. You don't, nothing else matters. We worked for 6 hours that day. Otto moved with the economy of someone who'd done this kind of work 1,000 times. No wasted motion, no long explanations. Just the steady click and tap of someone who understood how things were supposed to fit together. He showed me how to lap the poly sheeting so water would run off rather than pool. How to drive a screw at the right angle so it would hold in soft wood. How to read a rafter to know which ones still had life in them and which ones needed to come down before they came down on their own. My father built houses, he said at some point, handing me a length of sheeting. Did it during the Depression, when people couldn't afford not to have a roof over their heads. He always said, you don't build a house, you just keep deciding to stay. I didn't say anything. I just held up my end of the sheet. He came back the next Saturday and the one after that. Cassie found me on a Thursday in December. I hadn't told her where I was. I'd told no one. But Coalfield is a small town, and small towns move information the way water moves through limestone, slowly, invisibly, and eventually everywhere. She was wearing her good coat and had a folder under her arm, and she stood at the property line, like she wasn't sure she wanted to step onto it. Daddy, she said, this is ridiculous. I kept working. I was reinforcing a section of interior wall the way Otto had shown me. Drill, fasten, check the level, repeat. I'm not here to fight, she said. I just need you to sign one thing. She held out the folder. Inside was a quitclaim deed, my name on it, my signature dated 3 weeks ago, which was impossible because 3 weeks ago I'd been here pulling rotted wood off a farmhouse wall with bleeding hands. You didn't sign this, I said. You did, she said. Her voice was completely flat. You were confused about it afterward. That happens, Daddy. You've been under a lot of stress. I looked at her for a long moment. I thought about every version of the word confused I'd heard in my life, and how this one was different from all of them. Not an observation, but a weapon. There's nothing wrong with my mind, I said. I know that's how it feels, she said. Bo was standing by the car. He hadn't come up to the property line, just leaned against the hood with his arms crossed, watching. He called out, Ned, be reasonable. There's a developer interested in this parcel. You sign that deed, we can all walk away clean. He paused just long enough to let the next part land properly. Don't sign it and we go back to the judge. We've already spoken to your doctor about a capacity evaluation. I knew what that meant. I'd seen it happen to other men my age. The family files the right paperwork, the court appoints a guardian, and suddenly you can't sign a check, can't make your own medical decisions, can't determine where you live. Everything is managed for you. Everything is taken but legally. I handed the folder back to Cassie without opening it. You should leave now, I said. She left. But as she walked back to the car, I saw something in her posture, not defeat, not retreat. She walked like someone who had already moved to the next move on a board she'd been playing for years. That night I sat in the house by an oil lamp Otto had brought me, and I went through every piece of financial mail I'd been collecting at the Coalfield post office since October. I'd kept the mailbox out of habit. Clara had always insisted on a P.O. box for important documents, said you never know when you need a record that hasn't been through someone else's hands first. I hadn't changed it when Cassie took over the household accounts, and I'd been collecting what arrived there without opening it, because opening it meant confronting things I hadn't been ready to confront. I spread the statements out on the floor and went through them one by one. $34,000. Gone from my retirement account in withdrawals of $800, $1,200, $1,500. Starting 4 years ago, regular as breathing. A Social Security direct deposit I hadn't known about, quietly rerouted to an account I'd never opened, in my name but not in my control. Medical reimbursements from Clara's insurance, cashed and gone. Every transaction signed with my name. Every signature a perfect copy. 4 years. While Clara was dying, while I was working double shifts at the shop to cover what Medicare didn't, while I was sitting in hospital waiting rooms drinking bad coffee and trying to hold myself together, they had been taking it. Steadily, carefully. Small enough amounts that no single one would raise a flag. I sat on that plywood floor in that half-repaired house, and I held those statements and I did not cry. I'd already done my crying in the truck in the Dollar General parking lot. What I felt now was something colder and cleaner than grief. I felt like a man who had finally seen the complete shape of something he'd been standing inside without being able to understand. I called Otto the next morning. He listened without interrupting. Then he said, I know a woman in Wartburg. Elder law attorney, you're going to want to take every one of those documents to her. January brought ice. Real ice. The kind that coats every surface overnight and turns East Tennessee into something beautiful and merciless at the same time. I was inside working on the interior framing when I heard a sound from the road that didn't fit. Not a car, not wind, something smaller, thinner. I put down my hammer and listened. It came again, a voice ragged and faint calling for help. I grabbed my jacket and went out. About 70 yards down the lane, off in the drainage ditch that ran along Cider Hill Road, I found a boy, 16 years old, lying next to a dirt bike that had gone down on the ice. His jacket was soaked through. His left arm was bent at an angle that told me immediately it was broken, and he had stopped shivering, which, as any mechanic knows, is not when a problem gets better. It's when a problem stops warning you. I got him up. He was barely coherent, saying something about a shortcut, a trail he knew. I got him inside and stripped off his wet jacket and wrapped him in every dry layer I had. 3 blankets and my own sleeping bag. I put him closest to the wood stove I'd finally gotten working the week before. I splinted his arm with 2 pieces of straight wood and strips of cloth, the way my own father had shown me when I was a boy. Growing up in a house where you learned to fix things because calling someone wasn't always an option. His name was Eli. He told me that much before he went quiet. 3 hours later, a truck came barreling up the lane, and a woman named Della got out before it had fully stopped. She tracked her son's phone to the last coordinates it had signal, which was somewhere on Cider Hill Road, and she'd driven every inch of that road in the dark before she saw my light. She came through the door and saw her boy conscious and breathing and wrapped in blankets beside a warm stove, and she made a sound I won't try to put into words, the sound of someone who had been preparing for the worst and had that preparation taken away from them all at once. He would have been dead, she said quietly, to no one in particular. The temperature that night dropped to 9 degrees. Small towns work in ways I'd forgotten after years of keeping to myself. By the end of the week, half of Coalfield knew about the boy on Cider Hill. Della told people. People told people. And before I understood what was happening, there were trucks coming up the lane on a Saturday morning with materials stacked in the beds. A man named Ted who ran the lumber yard in town. A woman named Peggy who organized the mission committee at First Baptist. A retired contractor named Hap who showed up with a framing gun and didn't say much but worked steadily from 8 in the morning until the light was gone. They didn't come because they owed me anything. They came because Coalfield is the kind of place that still operates on the principle that what happens to one person here is everyone's business, or at least it can be, when something reminds them of that. The elder law attorney, Miss Cavett, filed the complaint in February. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation opened a case. The forensic accounting took 3 months, but what they found was thorough. 4 years of systematic elder financial abuse, forged signatures on 19 separate documents, an unauthorized redirect of my Social Security deposit and methodical withdrawals from both my retirement account and a small whole life policy Clara had maintained since the 1980s. Bo had done the technical work. He was a bank compliance officer by profession, which explained the precision of it. Cassie had known, and she had enabled it, and when investigators asked her about specific transactions, she said she couldn't recall. They were charged in April, both of them. I watched the news report from the farmhouse, sitting in a chair Otto had helped me build from barnwood. I didn't feel what I'd spent months imagining I would feel. I'd pictured something like triumph, something like vindication. What I actually felt was quieter than that. Tired, a little. Sad in the particular way you're sad about something that was already lost before you understood it was going. The court issued a restitution order. Some of the money came back, not all of it. Some is simply gone in the way money goes when people spend what isn't theirs, but enough. The house Clara had left me was returned to my name. The transfer Cassie had executed was vacated as part of the fraud judgment. I sold it. I didn't want to live there. Too many things had ended in that house, and I had learned by then that you can't build a future in a place that only reminds you of what was taken. I put the money into Cider Hill instead. By the following October, the farmhouse was livable in the real sense of the word. New roof, insulated walls, working heat, running water from a well pump Otto helped me install. A proper kitchen, a wood stove in the main room that could heat the whole house if you kept it fed. I built a workshop in the old barn. I'm a mechanic by training, but I'd always wanted to work wood, and Otto taught me what his father had taught him. Measure twice, cut once, build things that will outlast the reasons you built them. On Thursday evenings, I started inviting a few other men from town. Retired mostly, some recently widowed, all of them at that age where time carries a different weight than it used to. We work on small things. Chairs, simple boxes, a shelf here, a small table there, nothing fancy. Just the satisfaction of making something that will last. Della brings her son Eli sometimes. He's learning faster than any of us. People in Coalfield have taken to calling it the workshop on Cider Hill. I don't call it anything in particular. It's, it's just where I live and where I keep the light on and where the door stays unlocked. Because I know what it cost me once to have someone else hold the key. I think about that $20 sometimes. Not about what it bought, 2 acres of frozen mud, and a building that was losing its fight with gravity, but about what I chose to do with it. About the decision I made in that courthouse lobby with a yellow paper in my hand and nothing in the world but the last of my money and a photograph of Clara in my breast pocket. Clara used to say that the hardest thing in life isn't losing what you have. The hardest thing is deciding what you're going to build from what's left. She was right. She was almost always right about things like that. I was just too busy working to stop and listen properly. If you've ever heard a deadbolt click behind you and understood that something had ended, I want to ask you something directly. What did you do next? Did you stand there on that cold porch and wait for someone to come for you? Or did you eventually start moving? Because here is what I know from the other side of it. There is something out there with your name on it. It's probably broken. It probably looks worthless. Everybody in the room probably smiled when you reached for it. Reach for it anyway. Build something. Ask for help when you need it. And when you've got 4 walls and a warm stove, leave the door unlocked. That's the whole lesson. Everything else is just the work.